That's where I want to welcome in our next guest, Hilary Fordwich. Hilary is the president of Strawmark LLC. She's also a member of the British American Business Association and still with us. Karen Giorno, former senior advisor to the Trump 2016 campaign. Hilary, great to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Hilary, so last time we spoke, you pretty much called this. Your analysis was one of the most accurate I've had on the show. So I'm just going to ask you a very broad question. What happens here? Does she get a deal? And does Brexit happen?
I will stick to my original prediction. I don't think so. She's in a ghastly situation because obviously, as you just mentioned, her deal has been voted down twice, and the last was one of the largest majorities in parliamentary history by 149 votes. The statement she made the other night, I believe it was Wednesday night on the 9 o'clock news in the UK, was disastrous because what she did was she blamed the squabbling MPs being the members of parliament,
right,
for this debacle. Well, that isn't very good. When you want somebody's vote and you want somebody's backing, you don't blame them. So now she's had a number of backbenchers be infuriated, and quite a few of them actually. There were some Labour MPs that were willing to come to her side, and they have now stood their ground. So my prediction remains fast and steady, which is no deal is better than a bad deal. It has been a bad deal. Now, remember, earlier in the week, we had the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, say that there is no way there would be a third vote on a deal unless it was substantively different. It had to be substantial. Any changes had to be substantial. Well, thus far, there's no substantial changes. The EU hasn't given any substantial changes. Another thing I think is very important about the treatment Theresa May received in Brussels, first of all, she went on her knees begging. That did not make anyone in the UK feel very good. And she was actually left outside that room waiting for over 5 hours in a dark room with no lights and no windows, only with her 10 Downing Street sort of staffers and protectors there. So this was an actually humiliating experience for the UK. And I think it goes to show that the European nations aren't really the UK's friend. Interesting to note, actually, in Der Spiegel this week, there was an article by the Economic Institute, Research Institute in Germany, and they actually said, if this was the German parliament, we would never accept such a bad deal.
Right.
So the Germans actually end up being such one of the better allies of the UK. Who would have guessed that, you know, after a couple of world wars? But Angela Merkel, remember, the Germans see the light. The Germans just want to trade with the UK. 1 in 7 cars, German cars, goes into the UK. They export a tremendous amount of white goods, manufactured goods into the UK. So my broad answer to your broad question is, I still think there would be no deal next week. And the last point I have to make is that the the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Liz Truss, she has just come out and said that no deal and a crash out on the 29th would not be doom and gloom. She said this is not the sort of locust theory, the horde of locusts. And if you have an official like that saying we're ready and we are prepared for a no deal, I think it's likely. And lastly, I see the military as being convening in the nuclear bunker opposite 10 Downing Street. They're ready.
Yeah, I had an analyst on last week who said the last 2 points, pretty much what you did, that consumer confidence would be down, the markets would take a bit of a hit, but it would not be a catastrophe, and the military and law enforcement is gearing up, they're ready, they've got their contingencies. All right, President Trump's oldest son, Donald Trump.
And only pain would be...
the
only pain would be short term.
Right.
The pain would be there would be pain. There's no denying that. Short-term pain, short-term disruption. But 2 points I'd like to make. Number one, businesses, unlike politicians, actually make plans and execute against them and are very decisive. Business leaders in the UK have already struck deals with the United States in particular. 93% of all goods attained and purchased from the EU can be purchased elsewhere, predominantly the United States. And there's a number of hotel chains and liquor chains have already made deals with Californian winemakers. So my second point is, if only Donald Trump would come out with a large and expansive trade deal, this would be beneficial to the US, beneficial to US manufacturers, beneficial to US farmers, and you could call it the Churchill dividend. This has been a special relationship for many years. That's what I think Trump should do.
I like that, the Churchill dividend. All right, let's talk about President Trump, because his oldest son, Donald Trump Jr., recently wrote an op-ed in the Telegraph about Brexit. Now, he wrote that Prime Minister Theresa May ignored his father's advice, and that's why Brexit's taking so long. He also said it's just another example of deep state operatives, those being the ones in the UK, trying to subvert the will of the people. Now, Theresa May told the BBC recently that Trump told her she should sue the EU and not negotiate with him. So, Karen Giorno, former Trump senior advisor, right after the winning 2016 campaign, you were invited over to England to speak to Parliament about many things, this being one. Do you agree with Donald Trump Jr. that if Theresa May had listened to Donald Trump, she might be in a better strategic position right now?
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because not only do I agree with Don Jr., I was invited by Nigel Evans, who's an MP, to come over and speak to some of his colleagues. The opposition party was invited to come as well. We had over 100 people in the room, and along with members of the Henry Jackson Society under Dr. Alan Mendoza. They were fully on board with Donald Trump and what his advice was, John, to the Brexit movement and to the leadership, including Prime Minister May. So I find this really fascinating 2.5 years later, how we're getting into this troublesome spots when there was really good advice on the front end. And I think, I don't want to speak for MP Evans, but he was on board with the president's recommendations as well back then.
Hilary, what do you think? Had Theresa May listened to Donald Trump, would she be in a better position?
I couldn't agree more, absolutely. And I think that what's happened is the deep state, your original point was accurate in that the deep state has taken over. This is not the will of the British public. 17.5 million voters in a majority voted for Brexit. And actually interesting, those that voted against were predominantly only sort of around London, so you could consider them international types. But also you had Scotland and Wales and some in Northern Ireland. Those were the only Remain votes. So the will of the British public was to leave. And yes, you're right. Politicians, yet again, have thwarted the will of the people.
Do you agree that she should sue, Theresa May should sue the EU because of the games they're playing here? For the last 45 seconds to you, Hilary.
At this juncture, I think what's much more important, let's not focus on things that aren't going to get the British public anything. She should just pursue no deal and crash out on the 29th.
All right, Hilary Fordwich, always a pleasure to have you. Love your insights. You've been spot on. I think you're going to be again here, so we'll bring you back.